Good morning, everybody. If it's morning where you're at, it might also be afternoon, but just know that wherever you are, we really hope that it's good. We hope you're having an incredible Monday. What the opportunities God has given us today, this week to start with, is different than any other week. So I hope that you are at it and that you are able to see that God has a great plan for the work He has for you. You are with us today because we are continuing on this conversation in this post Child Discipleship Forum series, talking about what does it look like for us to take what we've learned. We're adjusting to this concept of our kids are living in a post-Christian culture. We're also then internalizing that and we're saying, okay, so what does this mean for me as a leader? What does it look like for me to have discipled them then? And now what is it going to look like for some of those things to be the same, but not all of them, and disciple them differently because of the culture we're living in? And so we've gathered today again with Chief Strategic Officer Matt Markins here at Awana. He's going to be helping us understand. So now that we've got all of this information, how do we then connect this and communicate it not only to our volunteer and like the volunteers that come around us, but also then our senior leadership? Because he will tell you one of the key ways that we're going to disciple and see the church of 2050 be leaders, having been kids in our church today, is through connecting our senior leadership to this vision of child discipleship. So as we dig into that conversation, as always, in the chat, there's opportunities for you to ask questions. Please do that. If you want to let us know already where you're at and even the area of children's ministry that you serve in, we'd love to hear from you as we kind of get started. So Matt, thank you as always for your time and joining us today.
It's great to be with you, Melanie. I'm excited.
Just so that you guys know, Matt, we actually have the privilege of having Matt in office right now. And so it's a good week when we're all able to come together. And I know that feels the same for you as you are leading your teams. And so this conversation, Matt, I wonder if you could help us really understand first, one of the ways that we begin to even talk about this with our senior pastors is that we've identified that ministry previous to where kind of we're at. And this isn't a post-COVID versus pre-COVID. This is just a cultural thing. Ministry before looks different than it looks like now and how we engage with the church. So I wonder, what's the difference? What have you seen as the difference between then and now?
Well, yeah, it's a great question, Melanie. I think that many churches, one of the things that we're reading now is a lot of churches are quote unquote going back to normal. There's a study that I read just recently that although we thought a lot of churches were going to come out of COVID, I know we're not out of it yet, but come out of COVID doing things a lot differently. And one study that I saw here recently said that the reality is most churches are doing things pretty much how they did before, with the exception of a few slight tweaks. Maybe we're doing a lot more online giving or a lot more online streaming and some other things like that. But largely, a lot of churches, not all, but many churches, we're really going back to our comfortable patterns. But we're also changed people. We're not the same individuals. We're hopefully we're a lot more empathetic. We're more in touch to the pain and the needs of the world around us. And I think we also saw that in the midst of all of the crazy, kids kind of kids fell between the cracks of our systems and our culture. And sometimes maybe they were even overlooked in the local church world. We had to think about how to make online stuff happen. But in the meantime, what was happening at home with children? So yeah, that's a big conversation just within and of itself right there. Yeah.
Yes, I know that in the past we've conversed around, there's some things that in the past have been good. There's also things that haven't worked quite as well. And one of these things, as we identify talking with our senior leadership, is identifying the difference between attractional-based ministry and discipleship, and both identifying the good, the bad, and the ugly of all of that, right? So what do you think that looks like, and how does that play into discipleship in today's culture?
Before we even go there, let's just kind of take one half step back and think about the importance of the relationship between us as children's ministry leaders and our senior pastor, our lead pastor. Depending on the scale of your church, it might be an executive pastor, et cetera. But it's a critically important relationship. So for those of us online here right now participating in this, you might be a children's ministry pastor, you might be a children's ministry director, or you might be an Awana leader, or some kind of a high capacity volunteer, but you're engaged in this because you care, right? But your lead pastor, many times we can feel distant from that senior pastor or that lead pastor in our church. But I think the reality is we want to be aligned and relationally attuned to the lead pastor and the senior pastor of our church. But many times the senior pastor may just not be as aware of what's happening in the children's ministry. But think about this. For those of us who played sports, or maybe you played music and you were part of a band, when one instrument or a group of instruments are just kind of off, the band is not quite making the beautiful music that it needs to, or a volleyball team with one player who's just really daydreaming and not participating, or even a spouse, in your marriage, you've got to be both highly engaged in what's happening. In the church, I think we have a real opportunity coming out of COVID to close those communication gaps and be in really good relationship and contact with our pastor, listening to our pastor's vision, mission, and heartbeat, and making sure that what we're doing with children aligns to that. I just think it's incredibly important. So with that as a baseline, like the importance of us as children's ministry leaders or volunteers or pastors being in tune with our lead pastor and the mission of the church. With that as a baseline, you asked the question, Melanie, about like moving from the attractional model of where we've come from in the past and where are things going in the future. So what is the attractional model? Let's talk about this for a minute. Another word, Melanie, for that would be what, like the church growth movement, like this idea probably came out of the 1950s and 60s and became more dominant in places like California and a handful of other churches or other states around the country, especially by the 1970s. But by the time you get into the 80s and 90s, the church growth mindset, or what would you call attractional, as you mentioned, Melanie, that became the dominant mindset of how a local church functions in our society. And I think it's important to note that it doesn't matter if you're a small church in rural Pennsylvania or a mega church in Kansas City, Kansas. Like this idea of attractional or church growth model, it really impacted all of us. Let me give an example.
Sure.
If you're the mega church in Los Angeles, you might have one of the Christian players from the Lakers come be a guest speaker with the motivation of what? Attracting more people to your church to get them in the building, right? But if you are from, Sulphur Springs, Arkansas, and your church is in a Southern gospel area, you might have what? And at your church, you might have a Southern gospel quartet come to your church, and you're going to put it out there on the church sign so that people driving by who hear about the gospel quartet in their magazines would come participate in that, right? So this idea of attractional is really something that many, not all, but many churches, mainstream church in the United States really has adopted. But here's the fallacy. We equated getting more people into the church to participate in church services. We equated that with more of those would equal more disciples. And I think we now know, this last decade in particular, we've now realized that that's not a one-to-one. This did not equal this. And so we're really experiencing a shift away from attractional. We've got to talk about where the church is going next.
Yeah. And so for so many of these leaders on that are listening to this today, they're going to identify to say, well, yeah, I mean, how many times have we heard from our senior leadership? Like, all right, so how do we equip the children's ministry to have what they need so that we get more families in, right? This idea of if we have a good, strong children's ministry, then we can disciple the parents. And for some, they here listening to this right now, they are the child advocate. They're the child discipleship advocate that are saying, yes, we have to make this more. And that is the very premise and point of this conversation, is that we're trying to bridge that gap around you who are saying, let's disciple well, let's do it in a way because these children need Jesus just as much as their parents do.
Yeah.
And this concept that's often pastors can come with that say, okay, how do we equip the children's ministry to be able to have kids in a way that brings parents in? And while that's all good, it's still missing this fundamental level of what you're saying, which
Yeah.
is discipleship for the kids that are coming to our churches.
So really, one of the reasons I brought up from the beginning that we as kids pastors or Awana leaders or children's ministry leaders, the reason I brought up the connection we have to have with our pastor is because children's ministry has to basically fall in line with the strategy or the vision of that lead pastor. And the dominant plan in the United States over the last several decades has been this idea of the lead pastor having a mentality of, I want to grow my church, which, by the way, is a great motivation. Who wants less people? Who wants to reach and disciple? Of course, we want to reach more people. But because the mindset was church growth, we're going to grow. We adopted a set of step 2, step 3, step 4 type of thinking based on that assumption that we have to just get more and more people. Therefore, the role of children's ministry became, we have to have an amazing children's ministry that's going to attract a lot of families. But again, at the surface, that sounds absolutely wonderful. Of course, we want to grow our church. And of course, we want an amazing children's ministry. But what happened is, in order to have that, thriving children's ministry, there was even a book written, I'm going to get the title wrong, but it's something along the lines of making children's ministry the best hour of a kid's week. But it was this idea of making children's ministry highly engaging, highly entertaining. But what happened in the process? Entertainment really crept up in the priority list. Melanie, you've been a children's ministry research person for many years now, and I know you remember the blogging even 10 years ago. One of the main themes in all the blogging that thought leaders in children's ministry was this idea of make your children's ministry like Disney
World.
Yep. Make your children's ministry like Disney World. So because of the attractional model, entertainment became a high value within children's ministry. Again, there's some good things about Disney.
Right.
It's clean, it's engaging, it's entertaining. There's some good values there, but good things that become inflated. What do we call that? We call that like a type of idolatry. Like this value became such a chief value. And on top of that, our culture has shifted from a quasi-Christian culture to a post-Christian culture. So we're now at a place where the thought leaders of our day and the Christian researchers have basically said attractional in a post-Christian culture is not going to work. It's not going to form resilient disciples in a culture that marginalizes the Christian faith. So if attractional model is in a post-Christian culture is not our future, we have to talk about what we're pivoting toward.
Yeah. So I love that. We have to talk about what we're pivoting towards, because I think something that we don't want people to hear right now is that we're saying that you shouldn't want to attract, and you said that a number of times, and let's just make that very clear. Wanting to bring families into your church is exactly what we've been called to do.
Absolutely.
Right? But to do it in a way that is entertainment based versus formational based are two very different platforms. So you say, as we point the way forward, what does that look like in terms of wanting to spiritually form, creating ministries based on formation and discipleship?
Yeah. So as the church really, we're at this unique time, and COVID gave us a great time to pause and reflect on everything we just talked about. So another kind of a church model that we quickly skipped in an effort to really summarize where we've been. It didn't become quite as big as the attractional model, but there was a model that came over the last several decades called the missional model, which is about engaging missionally in our community. Jesus, what were some of the things that Jesus was criticized for? He was criticized for hanging out with the sinners and the tax collectors, and for breaking bread with people who were considered to be the marginalized, unacceptable people. So Jesus modeled for us that we are supposed to get close to the pain and the sin and the brokenness of our community. We're supposed to do that. We're supposed to reach the lost with the gospel. And so there has been a movement toward missional living, missional church. And I think what we found out is that many churches went this direction, but they didn't have the robust disciple making. So we moved from attractional, which is about relevancy. Let's be cool. Let's be relevant. Let's make the gospel attractive. And we got all these people in. Then we pivoted from that right into missional, only to discover that we had not fully formed people in the image of Jesus. We hadn't formed and discipled people in a way that they were really ready to get out there and engage. The people were being more shaped by those they were ministering to than they were actually making disciples of them. So what I want to point out here, Melanie, is, as you were saying a moment ago, there are elements of the attractional model that are good. Of course, we want more people to come to know, love, and serve Jesus Christ. It's the idea of bringing more people into our church is not really the downfall. The downfall is this motivation of that's just grow at all costs, and the assumption that just by getting them here and them hearing the teaching and preaching that they would become disciples. Hearing and information is not our problem. We're hearing and taking in information all the time. We know that discipleship formation is more than hearing a sermon or singing some songs. It's actually life on life, other people coming alongside of you, mentoring you, as well as the practices and the disciplines and the routines and the habits of living in the ways of Jesus. So it's multifaceted. So that's where the church, again, parts of the church growth movement, positive, parts of the church growth movement, it just made way too many assumptions. So we moved to this missional, again, great motivations. Jesus said, what? Go into the world and make disciples. And he preach the gospel, make disciples, baptizing, teaching. Jesus said to do all this. So we're supposed to get close to the pain of our community. So again, also very good. But we're now into this kind of third movement because we've realized there are kind of gaps in both of these, in attractional, and there are gaps in missional. And the gap is what? The gap is formational, meaning disciple making. Who is forming me? Like, what is forming me? And so as this relates to today's children, our children are being obviously considerably formed by the dominant secular culture. And we're asking new questions around, okay, if this is how the secular culture is forming them and how rapidly it's forming them, what is it the church does that's going to disciple them or form them in the image of Jesus?
Oh man, there's so much there that I think is so unique, especially in the way that you've unpacked the good in all of it.
Yep.
But then also what's missing, and is specifically around this section of what was the attractional base. Like, if we're trying to create our children's ministries to be Disney World, then essentially we're creating consumers of Christianity, right?
Yep.
Because at Disney World, the only thing they require me to do is to pay a good chunk of cash, right? And then to just consume what they offer to me. And we know that that is not the kind of discipleship we're looking for. And yet there are parts of Disney that are good. So then shifting over to this missional of living in community and connecting and sharing the gospel is also so good. But then Jesus caused transformation in the lives of the people that followed after him. Right. And so I'd say, so as we look to this middle ground of formation, and formation may have tenets of attractional ministry based to it, and it's going to have tenets of missional ministry. What specifically are the key things that we should be talking about in formational ministry and discipleship?
Well, for those who have been tracking with Awana and with the research we've been doing really easily since 2013, for those of us who have tracked with the conversation, there are three primary factors that form a child disciple, and those are belong, believe, become. Or belong is highly relational, believe is deeply scriptural, become is truly experiential. And it's not really about any one of those elements. It's about all three working together, because these are the three basic needs that all humans have. Belonging is about community, believe is about meaning, and become is about freedom. Human development shows that these are some of our most basic needs. So what happens is when each one of those gets formed, as from a gospel perspective, you're shaping the child's identity as lasting faith in Jesus or a resilient disciple. But I think so. Let's make this super practical here, Melanie. What does this all have to do with our senior pastor?
Yeah.
The connection back to our senior pastor is many churches are still largely operating. I would say the dominant church model in the West, or in the US in particular, is this attractional model, church growth. We've got to get more people here. So even though we've shifted from a majority Christian culture to a post-Christian culture, we're still operating as if we're in the majority Christian culture, meaning attractional, becoming more relevant, more cool, and getting more people here. That idea is not going to work in the post-Christian realm. So as it relates to our children, if we're going to shift to a model that's more about discipleship or formational or lasting faith, if we're going to shift from attractional, let's be cool, let's be exciting, let's be fun. And by the way, we want to be all of those, but that's no longer like the big focus. The big focus is what in the world is it that produces a resilient disciple, lasting faith in kids? And let's put our primary energy into that. So if we're going to shift from here to here, we need to be on the same page with our pastor. And we need to walk that journey with our pastor and help our pastor understand the shift that we're making. And by the way, discipleship of children is also fun. It's also, I mean, working with kids has to be fun. You know, how could it not be fun? It's the most exciting work on the planet, but it is a shifting in priorities. And we don't want to surprise our senior pastor. We don't want to shock our senior pastor or leave them out of this conversation. So I think it's a time for dialogue where we ask our pastor, engage our pastor in conversations around, does our pastor see this shift taking place? What does this look like? What would it look like to have a different type of children's ministry that's more highly relational, which, by the way, highly relational may require a few more volunteers, a few more loving, caring adults. And so that's a mindset shift. And that's a conversation we've got to engage our pastors in.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is the premise of why we want to be here today, right? This was so good to get us kind of caught up to where we're at and really understand the shift that we're trying to bring to our pastors. And so for those of you who are listening, let's remember back to what Matt mentioned at the very beginning. You all may have varying degrees of relationship with your senior leadership. And so to just set a meeting on your calendar and then just plow through and say, hey, this is how we need to do it, and this is what it needs to look like, may not be the best way for you to be able to have this conversation. You need to have relational collateral and that depth of trust and ability to have this intentional conversation. And so it may just be first reaching out and saying, hey, can I update you with what our children's ministry is doing? And begin to unpack. This is what it looks like for us to disciple kids now, and that will help you to have that conversation later.
Yeah.
But then others of you are at the point where you say, yes, I'm involved in all of our staff meetings. Our senior pastor is always open. His door is always open for us to be able to have this conversation. And so then Matt and I are going to specifically talk about strategic steps. If you're at that point, knowing that you have relational collateral, how to then move forward and have this conversation. So Matt, you talk about to dig really deep and practical to begin identifying the shift. Where do we start in this conversation with our pastors? Because I think for me, I would have the tendency to just lay it all out all at once, and it could be very overwhelming and confusing. So if there was a place to start, what would that look like?
You know, it's nice. I don't know if any of you have ever done something and someone else brags on your work. It's so much better to have someone else brag on your work than to brag on your own work. There's a bishop of a denomination named Sean McKinney I believe he lives in Cleveland, Tennessee, and he said recently that the book Resilient that we published last year, he said the book Resilient is the most significant work written on children's ministry in the last 20 years. Wow. So those are his words. Those are his words, not my words. But I say that to say, if I were to engage my pastor in this conversation, I would open up some of the first few pages of the book Resilient. There's a chart near the beginning by Ed Stetzer. So if you don't have a copy of Resilient, pick up a copy. Melanie could probably drop in the chat where you can go pick up one of those. Worst case scenario, even put your email in there, Melanie. If someone is like, I don't have any money, just email Melanie. We will mail you a free copy. We're happy to do that. But if you don't have a copy and you do have $15 or whatever, just get online, get on Amazon, get on our website and buy it. But I would go over that Ed Stetzer chart with our pastor. It talks about the past, the present, and the future. And it shows how we're shifting from a majority Christian culture to a post-Christian culture, and that secularism is the dominant culture of today. And Melanie, I thought of this example recently. Have you seen the movie Titanic, like back in 1997?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
remember the band, the strings band that plays. You know, they're playing before they hit the iceberg.
Yeah.
So watching that band play before they hit the iceberg does not seem bizarre.
For sure.
However, watching that band play after they've hit the iceberg and the boat is sinking is bizarre. It's just strange to watch that. Now, okay, let's equate this to our culture. There was a time when in the United States when we lived in what you would call a majority Christian culture, meaning Christianity was accepted in mainstream culture. Billy Graham was like the ideal human being. Jesus was a relatively positive figure. The Bible and the church had value. All of those things are no longer the case. Billy Graham has been canceled, right? Like we are past all of that. We're in a culture now where our culture desires the fruit of Christianity, like redemption and freedom and love and happiness, but it doesn't want Jesus. It doesn't want the Bible. So my point in that is kind of like that band who, before hitting the iceberg, playing those violins that seem so beautiful and wonderful, but when the boat was on decline, it just seems out of place. So if we maintain this attractional mindset as when we were in a majority Christian culture, but now we're in cultural decline, right? Like continuing to entertain our kids and thinking that that's somehow going to produce and shape resilient disciples in this post-Christian world, it's really out of step with reality. And so I think one thing I would do to help my pastor see that is to look at that Ed Stetzer chart, and I would talk through that together. You know, that's one thing I think could really get the communication going so that we could ask the question, okay, pastor, what we're doing with our kids today, the way we've been doing children's ministry the last decade, is it going to form a resilient disciple who's going to thrive in a world where the Christian faith is highly marginalized, and really maybe even a culture where the agenda is to silence the Christian voice? And if that's the case, we need to ask, okay, what is it the church does that creates or that helps form the highest levels of lasting faith, and keep pursuing the answer to that question and put more energy into those things and let go of some of the lesser things of children's ministry. Like that right there, maybe the last 60 seconds of what I just said right there, I think that is the conversation for the future of children's ministry. And I think we're going to see more and more churches navigate down that pathway.
Yeah, Matt, that's such a great example and a place to start. Like, what would it look like? Excuse me. What would it look like for us to sit down with our senior leadership and just ask the question, how do you see us forming resilient disciples in our children? And just see if the senior pastor has an answer to that, right? How would they respond to that? And even if you have to take a step back from that and say, do you think that our church should be formed and patterned after an environment that forms resilient disciples in the children that we serve? And then I think anyone would probably stumble and probably say something like, well, yeah, of course we should. I absolutely think that we should. Then I think the next question then can go to that example you gave, that might even say like, okay, so would you say that then our ministry model is based more on attracting families or discipling them, right? And then that can help you dig into that conversation.
And let me add one more thing to that, Melanie. It's that Barna group stat that most humans' worldviews are shaped by the age of 13.
Yep.
So if we can paint that picture, if I can help our pastor, not that our pastor doesn't understand, but if we can make sure that we're on the same page, understanding with our pastor that we're in a highly secularized culture. So what is secularism? It's the dismissal of God and emphasis on the individual. What is a post-Christian culture? It's a culture that wants the fruit of Christianity, but without Christ.
Right.
So if our pastor fully realizes this is the water that our kids are swimming in, okay, period. Secondly, if then our pastor can realize on top of that, human worldview is pretty much set by age 13 in terms of how you view the framework of reality. Hopefully our pastor will be able to see, boy, if that's true, we've got to really have a really good approach and a good plan to the best of our ability in how we're equipping parents, in how we're using our time with children when we have them at midweek and on the weekends or whatever, to do anything we can to shape them as resilient disciples. So I think that Barna stat by age 13 is a big one. And so I would want to make sure, okay, that Ed Stetzer chart is a great conversation. The things you were just talking about is a great conversation. The Barna stat, like all of those can help, I think, set up a good conversation. But let's keep asking a couple of key questions. One of them we already asked, which is what we are doing today going to adequately prepare the resilient disciples who are going to engage the culture and lead the church of the future? I think another way of asking that is something that you and I and others discuss at the Child Discipleship Forum. Another way of asking that is, in a world of seemingly endless children's ministry options, which ones are going to produce more than likely produce lasting faith in children? And I think it's important to word it that way, because like you, Melanie, and like everyone else on this call, we've been to dozens of children's ministry conferences, and we live in a country in the very wealthy West where there's a lot of options. We have so many options. But what's the philosophy, the theology, the framework that's most known to produce lasting faith? And again, I would contend that it's those three areas of community or relationships, what we call belonging, combined with scripture engagement, scripture rich ministry, not a Bible light ministry, but a scripture rich ministry that clearly articulates the robust framework of the gospel to children. We call that believe. And then thirdly is what we call become, which is helping kids navigate a very tricky secular culture and helping walk alongside of them. So I think to do that, Melanie, I think a kids pastor or an Awana leader or a children's ministry director, I think we have to change our mindset to do two things: community builders and equippers. We got to be community builders and equippers. So historically, we may not have articulated this way, but historically we've run programs. We've run very entertaining, highly engaging weekend and midweek programs, which again, the program's not the problem. We're going to still run programs, but we've got to prioritize at a level higher than that: community builder and equipper. Now, how am I going to do community building and how am I going to do equipping? Probably by running some type of programs. But the programs need to be designed in this culture where kids are isolated and it's highly secularized. They need loving, caring adults who are part of their community engaging with them. And we need to equip these adults and these parents to actually engage the Bible, engage kids in the Bible, and to disciple them. So the shift from attractional to discipleship, or from attractional to formational, how does that change my job as a kids ministry leader? I become a community builder and I become an equipper. I think that's the pathway for the future. But I've got to help my pastor navigate these conversations, help my pastor see this is really what I need to be doing to be the most effective minister of the gospel.
Yeah. That's such a unique, again, sorry guys, that's such a unique distinction there, because I think that as we look, we would all identify and say, well, of course I want to be a community builder and an equipper,
absolutely.
Right. And so I don't think that concept of sitting in that is new, other than what I would consider the right sizing of the priorities of what we're doing.
There's nothing new in what I just said. And in no way am I intending to diminish the way we viewed our roles in the past. It's almost like, we're juggling 10 balls, right? But the reality is we need to maybe put a few down, and we need to prioritize a few that are left over, right?
Sure.
Like some of the things we're doing, like community building and equipping is already happening.
Right.
What I'm saying is they've got to be put at the very top of the priority
Right.
list, because
Right.
it's by doing those two things that we're going to be able to do those 3 Bs, and we're going to be able to form lasting faith. Because kids pastors are doing what? Like, let's name some of the things you do throughout the year: VBS, Sunday school,
Like a
large
fall
church, small
harvest
group,
kickoff. Yeah.
the fall harvest.
Big
Let's keep
events
going.
like that.
Big
Yeah.
events.
Yeah. I mean, midweek ministry and some sort of level.
Midweek, and you might have like a Christmas or a kids choir or something that's going on. We could probably list Easter. Yeah, we could list a dozen, maybe 15 things. Okay, all of those methodologies have real value. But if we said, or for a moment, we're just going to scoot all those to the side, and we said, what if we started over and we put community building and equipping as the top priorities? To what end?
Yep.
To do belonging, believing, becoming, relationship, scripture engagement, and experiences. Then what types of ministries and methodologies would we need to do that? Then you bring in all of the methods that we just mentioned. So we've got to start with these objectives and really redesign to those ends.
It's making me think so much about what I remember a dear friend asked me, honestly, probably like 6 or 7 years ago. They encouraged me to say, what do you want the families and the kids talking about when they leave your church? And they said, most parents are going to ask them the question, did you have fun?
Yeah.
And as the children's pastor, to be honest, that's the wrong question for them to be asking their kids, right? Like, yes, of course, do we want them to have fun? Yes. But more importantly, it's like, what did they learn about Jesus that week? How did they see God that week? What did it look like for them to see God through laughter? What did it look like for them to see God through joy? And we kind of unpack that. But it really, that just reminds me exactly of what you're talking about right now, is that it's not that all of these different events and the things that we can do aren't good. It's that when we base them off of what can we do to attract more families, like we want to get to 700 new families this year. It's the difference between saying, actually, we want to build community and we want to equip our leaders. So then if we want to do those two things, how does this Easter event fit into that?
Yes,
and that might be a byproduct of, we are going to have 300 to 400 new families. It's totally fine.
Yeah.
But it's again, that priority level that you're talking about.
You know what you just said, there's a classic business story of Truett Cathy, the Chick-fil-A, the founder of Chick-fil-A.
Yep.
There's a classic business story where he was upset in a meeting and he pounds the table and he says, I'm tired of everyone talking about us getting bigger. He said, I want to talk about getting better, because if we get better, the customers will demand that we get bigger. And I realize that's a business conversation, but the ideas are really the same. If a church is truly doing well at building community, and by the way, community alone is like, when you find a rich, vibrant, loving, caring community, do you want to walk away from that? No, you don't want to walk away from that. Right. You find yourself saying, why would I not want to be a part of this? Right. So when you find yourself building rich community and then equipping people to engage kids, to care for kids, to engage kids in the Bible, to disciple them, to teach lessons, and so on and so forth. When you do those two things, guess what's probably going to happen? You're probably going to end up growing as a church, because you're going to be vibrant. You're going to be filled with life. You're going to be filled with the Holy Spirit, and God's going to do something really special. Again, it's just a shift in mindset of changing from grow bigger, bigger, bigger to we're going to grow Jesus inside of people. We're going to form people in Jesus's image. Yeah.
That is so key. And I think I keep resonating too, Matt, with what you were talking about around the worldview. And I think there was something specific there that caught my attention. You mentioned that a human's worldview is set by the age of 12 or 13, right? And I think that what's unique about that is that worldview can either be steered towards culture and discipled by culture, or it can be a biblical worldview. Like it's not ensuring, just because a child attends church does not ensure that they are going to have a biblical worldview. In fact, More data that has been put out by Barna has come out to say that of Gen Z, of all of Gen Z, only 4% of them identify as having a biblical worldview.
Mhm.
And so that's another piece to then take to your pastor
Yeah.
that says, like, okay, so in tandem with this conversation that their worldview is going to be set by the time of 12 or 13, are we fashioning them as disciples? Are we giving them opportunities to love Jesus early enough
Yeah.
and deep enough
Yeah.
at that beginning stage? And then two, are we helping them? And so to bring all of that together, it almost kind of makes me feel like it puts us at this point of, as leaders, wanting to vision cast. We talk a lot about the church of 2050 and where are we headed and how do we make the kids in our churches the resilient, discipled leaders of the church of 2050.
Yeah.
So what does it look like for us to kind of sit in that vision, specifically with our children, with our senior leadership, and trying to understand the future church and how today's church impacts that?
Yeah. So let's end on this. I think it just goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is conversation and dialogue and praying together with our. I think we've kind of outlined a pretty good arc. That censor chart, the shifting from Christian culture to post-Christian culture, the worldview, identity, and what is it we're going to do to shape them. I think those are the right conversations. But let me end on this thought, Melanie. You and I were talking about this last week. What was it? We heard this in a podcast recently. What was it that made the church growth movement possible? It was the car. The vehicle was invented in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s. I'm not like a Henry Ford expert, but the car was invented in the early 1900s, and by the 1950s, like the average American home probably had one car. So this idea that, hey, we're going to build another church across town that's going to be more exciting, that's going to have a little more fun, that's going to have better music. I mean, after all, we're Americans. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Like, that's how we think. That's what we're taught in elementary school. So if you've got options, and I can, I don't have to go to the neighborhood community church that's 3 blocks away or 7 blocks away. And as our grandparents would walk to that church, or take the horse and buggy, we actually could hop in a car, and for probably a dime worth of gas, right? Like, I can go back and forth to church and I can find a quote unquote better church. It's because of the car that's possible. Well, think about this. What if all of a sudden there were no cars? What if you and I had to walk to church like our parents and grandparents, or like our great grandparents did?
Right.
I got to be honest with you, Melanie. I drive 30 minutes to get to church.
Same here.
I'm no longer going to the same church. Like, if we go back to a world with no cars, I'm going to walk down the street to one of the 3 or 4 churches that's in close proximity. And I've got a few options, but my options are limited, right? I think as we've got to put ourselves in those types of situations to do a mental exercise to say, what are we really after here? If we had to start over, what would our motivations be for the type of approach we'd want to take? So I would talk to my pastor about that. Like, if there were no cars and we were going to only reach people who were in walking distance to our church, what would we be about? And I think that's a really good exercise to go through, to really put our feet on the ground, to help us realize what the attractional model has done to us. Again, the good, the bad, and everything in between. And have the conversations around, what if, like Jesus, we focused on forming the few, discipling the ones that God brings to us, and going deep with them. And by the way, those people are going to be more, they're going to be growing more. I love the kids in the background, by the way. They're going to be growing deeper. And guess what they're going to be doing? They're going to be ministering alongside of you, increasing the horsepower, the Holy Spirit power of your church. And so these are the conversations that we can have with our pastor. And I love the cute kids. We're about kids ministry. This is so great.
I know. I love it too. And we're going to wrap up here because I think this is such a great place to settle. But Matt, I think what you're saying is we are going to be connecting with our pastor about what does it look like to say, if this is the leader of 2050, right? Who is it that is going to be leading? And what were the moments of like formational discipleship that led them to this place? And then as a church, implement that discipleship journey so that you can help gather people. And in that incredible Truett Cathy story, it's not that because we're just attracting more people, it's that because the discipleship, the pathway of the people in our churches and the transformation that Jesus is doing in their lives is so big that people are coming because they want to have an interaction like that with Jesus as well.
That's right. Amen. I love that.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much for being here on with us today. There will be future events. We will continue to keep you updated to what those will be. If you guys have any questions, I've added my email into the chat here. Please reach out to me. I would love to just specifically connect with you. But in the meantime, look out for our next online event on November 18th with Leah Broach. She and I are going to be really digging deep into this practical conversation about, so how does this change our ministries like this Sunday? Like, we're not talking about things that we need to implement over a multiple year kind of time. We're talking about things that can help transform our churches this upcoming Sunday. So check out your email. I will send you guys the replay link to this event and also the registration link to that as well. Matt, thank you so much for being here. And again, everybody, have an incredible week, and may you see God differently this week in a way that helps you know him better. We'll talk to you guys later.